Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Maha. Yahya. I'm the director of the center, the Carnegie Middle East Center. Allow me to welcome you to this fireside chat, even though there's no fire, and hopefully there won't be any fire, with Her Excellency, Sigrid Kaag, who actually I think needs no introduction in Lebanon, but nevertheless I will try and give some justice to the long career, but also the accomplishments that Sigrid has achieved. I can't tell you how delighted I am to have you here. Her Excellency is, until last October, was the UN General Secretary's Special Representative to Lebanon. That was, and today she is the Minister of Trade and International Cooperation, something that is increasingly important in the age of growing isolationism, trends, and populist rhetoric. At the same time, she is a universalist who speaks 6 languages, no less, and is able to move seamlessly between cultures and between countries and between people. Sigrid has a long and distinguished career at the United Nations, where her last posting before coming to Lebanon was to lead the mission to eliminate chemical weapons in Syria. And she describes herself as a staunch feminist seeking to empower women and help them rise to their potential. When in Lebanon, I recall you were a tireless advocate of the he for she movement. Yeah. So without further ado, what we're going to do is a kind of a Q&A with Her Excellency, and then we'll open it up for discussions, and we'll be covering a lot of these topics. Do you want to say anything before
No, I think first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and I hope this indeed, Maha and I said we'll kick it off, but obviously there's so many experts, friends, committed individuals and professors, writers, journalists in the room that who am I to fly by and give a few passing comments, but I hope it'll stimulate debate in a sort of triangular fashion between us and yourselves. And sadly, there's probably no perfect wisdom, where there's just some guidance or direction of travel. And I hope that I can contribute basically to that discourse. So I'm just delighted to be back. And I decided already that this trip was too short. It was purely work-related. But next time I'll come back and just give myself the pleasure to, in a personal capacity, come on holiday and enjoy all that is there to cherish in Lebanon, people and country.
I think the waiting list is going to start from now. Your Excellency, you recently released a report entitled Investing in Global Prospects, which states that the multilateral system that rules the world today has to undergo considerable reforms. Can you perhaps discuss what kind of reforms is the Netherlands looking for in this multilateral system? Particularly because the strategy itself also focuses on 4 key priorities, which you obviously see as strategic and central to the kind of changes that we are looking for in the world.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think in short, the strategy itself is basically looking at a prevention agenda. Not surprisingly, it's probably, I've been influenced by my time at the UN, where also internationally the Secretary General was discussing how to prevent. And prevention is not conflict, prevention is all those steps before, by addressing root causes, by looking at issues of poverty, impact of climate change, oppression, violations of human rights. If we address those in a proper, systematic way internationally, and look at the Sustainable Development Goals as a way of achieving and realizing measurable progress, we come a long way in actually prevention with a capital P. That is the framing of the policy. Now, I have basically 2 tools, 2 hats and 2 tools. One of them is international trade, foreign trade. The other one is development cooperation. Both are quite big for the Netherlands. We're small in size, but as you know, not dissimilar to Lebanon. We trade, and we've traded in our history effectively and successfully. But we participate in the global economy. We have tools, we have companies, we have instruments, we have access to global markets. That's one. Most countries want to evolve and participate. Actually, nobody wants to see themselves as an aid recipient. So we work with a number of other instruments, international cooperation, financing, to help countries achieve progress on the SDGs, sets of indicators, in areas where we see priorities. Now, why do we want the international system to be effective? As a small, medium-sized country, We like to, historically we would say we're the bigger ones amongst the small ones. Don't let some countries above us geographically hear that, but we like to see ourselves as the larger one of the smaller ones, but of course we're no Italy, we're no Germany, we're no France or the UK. But in this realm where you see Brexit, a buyout, unilateral decisions of international agreements, the US stepping away from the Paris Accords, pressures in the trade war, discussions on the utility or relevance of the World Trade Organization. All that is basically the legacy, the heritage, and an effective one so far, of the post-World War II order. But because of all the system changes, unilateral decisions, the entire system is shaken to an extent that we feel we will still collectively lose significantly more than the short-term benefits of unilateral decisions that may give some quick relief or may get you some fairly populist support, but it will ultimately erode and undermine and finish with the order that we have built. And there are tremendous pressures on the system. We see, from a peace and security perspective, development, international trade, or the global economy, we see only benefits in significant reform. Does the WTO need to be reformed? Yes, unequivocally. I'm saying nothing else I'm saying here as I would say in WTO. The how? Long process. Do politicians have patience? Often not. The answer lies often in the agenda. The WTO, from our perspective, needs to have a modern agenda, not only look anymore, and I won't go too much into technicalities, unless there's a trade expert in the room, but the GATT agenda or the Doha agenda, which has been lingering and hovering, important to many countries, but it doesn't deal with e-commerce or financial services. It doesn't deal with the new economy that most countries and people like to participate in. It doesn't deal with the fourth industrial revolution. So reform is on content and on the way you negotiate. So if one country blocks, it's not that everybody else gets stuck. Maybe plurilaterally, little coalitions can proceed. I'm using this as an example because it's pretty accurate, actually, as we're talking about US tariffs, EU tariffs, China tariffs. And this is one big shift. If you look at the way of delivering when it comes to peace and security, I think I need to tell no one in the Middle East that there is tremendous skepticism over the last, well, for a long time, over the credibility, inclusiveness of the Security Council. Resolutions adopted, resolutions not complied with. What follows next? That is, of course, for member states to improve. It's a big one. The development system of the UN and the World Bank, do recipients or clients in developing countries feel that they're getting actually their rights achieved or delivered? Often what they see is a fairly hefty, heavy system, and is very de-linked from their current reality. So this is what we mean by reform. We are a big donor. We are always in the top 10, certainly to the UN development system and many other organizations, and we feel it comes with our duty of care. It's also our responsibility and accountability also towards our taxpayers, who are increasingly also influenced by the question, yeah, this system, it's fine. Well, you know what? Questions I often get, why don't you spend it on care for the elderly back home? And they have a point, but I believe that shared prosperity is shared security, is shared stability. Hence, I feel as an OECD country, an EU member state that can still afford it, it is not only the right thing to do, it is the smart thing to do, to invest in the opportunities for others and lift up their well-being and create opportunities. That's why the title of the new policy was consciously chosen. It's also intended to be a smart response in a policy-oriented way to populism that just says, close down, don't spend, withdraw. My country for my kind of people. That is not the person I am, and that is certainly also not the party or the cabinet that I represent. Do we need to adjust to the new challenges? Can Europe deal with irregular migration flows? No, as you've seen. But there is a humane and balanced way, and organizations also need to adjust. But we're in this together. Long answer, sorry, but as you can tell, I'm quite passionate about this.
No, we're in this together and can only achieve together, quite honestly, if we want to achieve anything meaningful in this region. That moving to Lebanon, since you're here on an official visit to Lebanon, we were talking about shared prosperity. The Netherlands has and continues to be a significant supporter through the CEDR conference. The Netherlands donated 200 million euros in grants and another 100 million in that were earmarked for reforms. So it also, I mean, it has also expressed its commitment to both strengthening Lebanese institutions, but also protecting the most vulnerable groups. So my question is, how do you see these twin goals being achieved? Protecting institutions and, empowering institutions and protecting vulnerable groups. What kind of reforms is the Netherlands looking for in Lebanon? How, under what conditions will these funds be released in a certain way?
Well, thank you very much.
And maybe last one, to add to it, have you discussed any of these reforms? I know you've already seen the President, the Prime Minister, and the Speaker of Parliament, so have you discussed any of these reforms with them?
Yes and no. I mean, first of all, of course, our statement at the CEDR conference was quite clear, and we were one of the few countries that actually committed only grants. No loans, it's all grants. The loan effect is still a totally separate basket that is really for foreign direct investment opportunities, for creating Lebanese businesses and creating partnerships. So that's still aside. That may still be coming, provided indeed the enabling environment, policy-wise, government-wise, is addressed. Now, the grants, I think, are almost the easier part, because, of course, they speak to support for vulnerable Lebanese, investment in Lebanese host communities. It speaks, of course, to the need of UNHCR to assist the Syrian refugees. And we had already earlier this year reaffirmed our global commitment to UNRWA, of which also the Palestine refugees in Lebanon are a beneficiary. But that aside, I think the grant part is the easier. It is the broad program that you know since the start of the Syria crisis. It is it's sort of soft conditionality that we've introduced as a sense of urgency, knowing that elections before CEDR, of course, was a month before the Lebanese elections. We also wanted to pass a message. And that is not that we don't recognize, and I think first and foremost, the tremendous hospitality, generosity, and solidarity that the people of Lebanon continue to express towards the Syrian refugees. I think the economic cost and the socio-economic tensions potentially that flow from this need to be recognized certainly by all countries outside, and that keep asking Lebanon to keep hosting. There's an exchange here somewhere, because we know that you didn't ask, but you did it. You undertook it without knowing what lies ahead. However, there is a government responsibility and accountability to deliver services in a transparent manner to Lebanon citizens. And this part, of course, is a long story. I'm not naive here, but when you give grants, and I come back to our taxpayers as well, we need to be able to justify and explain. So for us, areas of fiscal reform, a true agenda to address corruption, and that doesn't mean you sort of arrest the poor little guy around the corner who's been seen to be taking 5,000 liras. I'm talking about a wider agenda where you address, you measure, and you have compliance, including by judicial pursuit. It has to be the entire cycle. We're looking at also quality delivery, and anti-corruption is also in program implementation. And here we choose partners. So unless there is a program, I also, given global developments and basically, short-term donor orientation, I would say, there's a crisis tomorrow, the impact of possible trade war on everyone's economy will also dwindle budgets. And in that regard, it's very important that countries such as Lebanon and Jordan, notwithstanding their tremendous domestic issues, are seen to be trying to achieve in a way that any government would want to show its citizens that this is how governance happens. So the areas are not new. I'm looking at our World Bank colleague, I believe, and I'm looking at others, and Rami Khouri, you've written on this many times. None of the areas are miracle themes, but they need to be addressed. And they need to be implemented. And I think first and foremost, Lebanese citizens, of course, will ask this of their parliamentarians, of the people they have elected or have elected to represent them in government.
Did you feel that there is a meeting of the minds? I mean, is there an agreement amongst the leadership, but even a meeting of the minds on the needed reforms between the international community and the Lebanese political elite?
Well, I think the beauty of anti-corruption agenda is you find this globally. I'll just stick for ease of reference now globally. Everyone agrees always that corruption needs to be dealt with. But someone often people in countries tend to be looking around, or the country next door, or the person they're not in alliance with. But of course, this is a shared issue. This affects all citizens. It corrupts the quality of services. It obfuscates the cost to the economy, and ultimately citizens pay the price. Because it's the middle class and the poor worker that has no means that is paying the bills and needs to find continuously other ways. Fiscal policy equally so. And of course, governance on banking. I mean, we all need to look at a global economic climate that can be giving us the so-called famous unknowns. Because I come back again, I mean, maybe because I come from Europe now, I apologize if I sound Eurocentric, but Brexit will affect not only the European Union countries, it has a broader remit. If a trade conflict evolves into a wider situation, this will have a global impact, all countries. And hence, if we're all in this together, we need to manage responsibly. Of course, there is no government yet. There is negotiations about a government. And I look forward to hearing what the declaration of government, what it will entail, what the commitments will be, and what the platform. I haven't read the McKinsey report yet. I must confess, I'm not sure if I will. It seems to be 1,000 pages, so I look forward to the executive summary. But the report itself should be very, very clear. I know sectors have been chosen, but governance around the sectors is very, very important to be politically accountable, but also accountable in the partnership that was signed with the international community and the CEDRE conference. There's a lot of goodwill, and Lebanon deserves it. But goodwill is something you need to keep nurturing and retaining, and we need to do our best, of course, to help Lebanon achieve. But everybody has a role to play.
It's a two-way street.
Yeah.
Moving on next door to Syria, and particularly since we seem to be talking about accountability, what we're looking at is a context where there doesn't seem to be a political settlement in sight. We have a military push. There's an evident political deadlock. So my question is, what role could the EU play? Will it just about containing the problem, or trying to breathe a new life into a political settlement? Can Europe play that role in that context? Which will bring me now to another question on issues of accountability, but I'll leave you to begin with that. Yeah. And what are the expectations from the Helsinki process, or the Helsinki meeting?
The last one I'll skip. But because we're not part of setting the agenda, so I think I would just be sort of recapping what everybody else may read or not read. I think what's important, there's two levels here as to the EU. There's often, I think, a global expectation of the EU to play that very distinct political role. Given the many different agendas on which many EU member states don't necessarily agree with one another, the migration debate is, of course, one of them. There are very different nuances and perspectives. You see the same when it comes, as I mentioned, on other situations. I think the EU position on the need for a political solution through a politically agreed transition in Syria hasn't changed, hasn't shifted. The second level remains commitment to the Geneva process. And third, that until there is a politically agreed transition, there will be no reconstruction financed by the EU. Now, is that cast in stone? I cannot predict that, but that is certainly the position of the Netherlands, and I know many EU states. That position is publicly declared and reiterated by the High Representative Federica Mogherini. And in that realm, I don't see a change.
No, this is important because one of the key issues that many are asking for is some sense of accountability. And since you brought out the issue of accountability multiple times, it is central. So if there is going to be any kind of rebuilding, and you just said there won't be, so...
Well, reconstruction is one, but of course the Netherlands, and I believe a few other EU member states, are investing in when it comes to transitional justice into the accountability mechanism. I forget just for the second now what it's officially called, the IIJM, I believe, into the
international.
It's a justice where we support the team of investigators, those who collect the data that will be used in due course to seek justice for all the victims of all the crimes committed in this conflict. So that's also the high end of accountability, which is very necessary for any future when that moment comes.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's important actually to, if there is that kind of level of data gathering, if you like, it also perhaps helps us avoid a post, where only the leadership is held accountable and no one else is held accountable. Let me ask, in terms of coming back to Lebanon again, the fact that there is a military rather than a political solution in Syria today will obviously have ramifications on the country, especially with the probable continued protracted displacement of a substantial chunk of refugees. This is happening at a time when the tensions and fears around refugee presence in Lebanon is increasing. We saw Lebanon's rejection of the EU UN statement after the Brussels donor conference. We've seen the measures taken by the Minister of Foreign Affairs against UNHCR and increasing rhetoric. So what can the international do to protect the fundamental human rights of vulnerable groups like refugees whilst addressing the profound and what some would say the existential fears of protracted displacement in a country like Lebanon that has seen this before? I mean, they say they've seen this movie before. And what leverage does the EU have to address this particular issue? Especially at a time when concepts like voluntary return that we keep emphasizing, the question of non-refoulement, are in a sense losing their meaning when you're in a situation where the host country is pushing people out and yet the country they come from does not want them back.
I seem to have come to Lebanon in that sense at the dawn of maybe a new era, and I want to be very cautious in what I say. First of all, I don't want to be adding fuel to the fire in any way, because I think a lot of these issues are very important, but debating them through the media in a comment on a comment in a way that I think is unique to Lebanon is maybe not actually helping. Our interest remains as the Netherlands, as an EU member state, but I can only speak for the Netherlands at the moment, of course, in both providing protection to those who are most vulnerable, be they Syrian refugees or Palestine refugees, as protected by UNRWA, and secondly, of course, recognizing and acknowledging, hence our grants to Lebanon, and with a significantly other package of properly investment opportunities, recognizing that Lebanon's stability has also been dealt a blow, that a situation of unknown and citing data that the average refugee stays X number of years in a host country is causing tremendous anxiety for people. And it's at a time when in many countries politicians play with this sensation, and it creates unease. And I think we need to recognize the unease among citizens. At the same time, it's important that we can both calm, allay, and provide real-time relief. It's also important that we continue to support, which we do, the position of UNHCR, that there's a voluntary return always, voluntary, safe, and dignified. Conditions for return, our assessment is, based on UNHCR, that the time is not yet there. But it's important to also recognize that there can be no way of people that want to go back home, then they cannot be stopped. They ought to be assisted. At the same time, their country of origin needs to take them back. And it's in this very gray zone of uncertainty, machinations and engineering that a lot of dangers lie to the protection agenda. And I think we need to be very mindful, very careful, but we also need to work with documented cases. it's very dangerous, and I'm certainly not a lawyer, but we cannot speak about situations if people are not there to witness, if people cannot be interviewed. It's very, very important. Last but not least, I think, and this comes a little bit back maybe to my old favorite ground of 1701, it's the authority of state that is important. So be it no arms outside the authority of state, be it that all decisions regarding management, border management, those are matters of state when you look at sovereignty, integrity of state, territorial integrity. And I think that's important, and I hope that in the formation of the government, of course, these issues are also carefully deliberated. Because a grey zone there can certainly be confusing, to put it like that.
And can threaten Lebanon's international standing,
It's
to some extent.
Questions would be asked indeed, i.e. the question, of course, is very important that the government is in charge, the government takes decisions, the government handles the files, and there is a sort of go-to person, which we would hope to, which has always been the case so far.
Since we're on the topic of 1701, can you tell us a little bit more about the push by the United States to decrease funding to UNIFIL, and at a time of increasing regional turmoil, and what the implications of that would be, and whatever else you want to say about 1701?
I'm not sure about that one. If you're referring to the US interest in seeing a reform of peacekeeping operations, and therefore also the budgetary implications, I thought that was dealt with last year, unless there are new developments.
There's a new renewal coming up in August.
Well, the renewals are yearly, as you know, and it's always fascinating to see how much is written about it. I think I would encourage all to look at the content of the Secretary General's report, which drives the discussion in the Security Council. And I imagine there'll be, just speaking from past experience, there'll be some language on the elections, because they were peacefully and well conducted, that there'll be an interest by Security Council members. We are on the Council, so I know that we will be asking about the formation of the government, the declaration of the government. I remember at the time of the earlier government, the Bayan al-Hukuma is very important. We look for language, international community always does, Security Council members certainly. And then of course the conduct of UNIFIL, violations by all parties, and what is being done by all sides. But I am not writing the report, so I'm just in a purely speculative mode at this moment. But I had not followed up on the matters that there was speculation on the budget. I actually don't know.
Okay. You once said, I believe in an equitable world, in a fair world. Shared prosperity also means greater collective security. Mm-hmm. And these are the issues we can work towards. Not everything is geopolitics. Mm. A lot of what we aim to do for and with others. And yet, here we are in a region where a political reality is being imposed through geopolitics, but also through violence and blood. Mm-hmm. How will the EU navigate, and I'm asking as someone
a member
state from the EU, how will the EU navigate between political pragmatism of what is, becoming some sort of a political reality in this region, and its commitments for fundamental human rights, especially support for organizations that also advocate for fundamental freedoms. So fundamental human rights for individuals, but also support for organizations that advocate for fundamental human freedoms, and where the EU has actually played an important role in their continued sustainability until now.
Yeah, that's a good one. When you look always, I think Lebanon has sometimes an advantage and a disadvantage. On the one hand, when countries outside the region look at Lebanon in a context of the battle against Daesh, Iraq, Syria, the human rights situation, of course, in Lebanon is like, well, okay, yes, there are issues, we need to deal with them, but it all becomes, on an absolute scale, it becomes a different debate. I think Lebanon, to my mind, is always still the human rights community, and the investments we can make through Lebanon have a tremendous potential to influence, encourage other organizations in other countries whose human rights agenda and voice is significantly under duress. I've always believed that, and I think Lebanon, alongside Tunisia at another time, were the two sort of lighthouses to say where change can happen, and also can be a pushback to those outside the region that say, oh, it's all cultural, therefore nothing will change. No. It is evidence-based, it is policy, it is good introductions, good law, and people courageous enough to go make this happen. Hence, it's important, certainly from our perspective, we will continue to focus on three themes. LGBTI, because this is for us in our global policy. We support all LGBTI-oriented organizations around a specific agenda in all countries. Secondly, a particular follow-up on all issues related to torture, also bearing in mind the recommendations of the Commission against torture, where there was a sort of a silence, and then apparently you just mentioned to me that there was more reporting. But I care about implementation. Reports are great. It's a first step, but it's what happens afterwards that's important. And then, of course, we want to look we look in this region at religious and ethnic communities, but above all also, of course, rights of women and those who need protection and assistance. So you can have the legal debate, that lens, and we translate it also to a protection agenda. This is how, for us, it fits. How is the situation? I'd have to see the latest report. But I remember when Lebanon submitted its report to the UPR, there was tremendous debate, activism by civil society in particular, round tables, etc., etc. But sometimes the problem is we send reports, or rather reports go to Geneva, they get debated, and then everybody says, okay, the reporting cycle is done, except the human rights community. And we need, of course, to have for everybody to feel human rights are everyone's business, and that you have to be mindful and watchful, because even in countries where human rights were considered to be sort of okay and attained, there is tremendous global pressure, there is a shrinking space on the human rights agenda globally. This is the case, of course. I will not seek to compare European countries with countries in the region, but we should all be concerned, mostly concerned when it concerns gross violations, but we have to express our voice, engage, and put our money where our mouth is. We do that in a very humble way, modest way, but hopefully effective. And I really count on the Lebanese, with all their creativity and more than greater political resilience than any other nation, to sort of continue to lead the way, because it's about the whole Middle East, to my mind.
No, absolutely, and it's not just about the violence, where the closing space is happening in places like Egypt, and across the region, as you say. And so the need for continued support for these organizations, and the EU really has played a very important role, I think, at that level. Final question before we open it up to the audience has to be about women. You describe yourself as a feminist and have always advocated for gender equality, and you've committed and dedicated yourself to this in many ways. So what policies are being enacted in your own ministry in the Netherlands where you feel there still needs to be more to be done, but also through the support that the Netherlands is providing to other organizations or to other countries, whether it be technical assistance?
Well, in our ministry, it's almost straightforward. We have a sort of a gender action plan. We measure, we look at the number of appointments. We want to aim to get 50-50 level of ambassadorial representation, and that's your, I would say, almost average gender advancement action plan. But the Netherlands, actually, we're not doing very well when you look at the EU. We trail when it comes to women at the top. We trail at CEOs in business. We trail tremendously. We have nice, and I have to say this out front, we are nice talking abroad, but within an EU setting, an OECD setting, we're in the bottom tier. So my message domestically is always we need to do much better, and it takes some humility, because we ask a lot of others or suggest a lot, but we're somehow within our own society not able to achieve. But we have an action plan. When you look abroad and working with organizations or in countries, we have a new action plan that needs to address, and it's related to gender equality, sexual abuse and abuse of power and sexual abuse in developing countries and countries where we work or we sponsor organizations that work there. It's not just the Oxfam Novib scandals or Haiti scandals, for those of you who followed it. There is a grave concern about continued abuse within this sector, and we need to take it seriously, and we have a policy of zero tolerance. The message is that abuse and abuse in your situation, and particularly of women and vulnerable boys and girls, is unacceptable. We have a whole policy. On the more positive side, and I refer you all to the part of the policy I'm particularly proud of, it's page 26, 27, it's online, it's red in the book when you see the printed version. It is all areas of gender indicators and markers. We will measure and mark everything we do, from trade to aid and aid to trade. All our decisions will be gender benchmarked. And this is basically to encourage and incentivize, but also make sure that all of us in the ministry and our partners do the right thing, that we don't just talk gender, we actually act and we engender our decisions. And at the same time also is to hold ourselves accountable, because probably the reality will be that it's quite hard. And then we can look back and say we didn't do very well. If so, what are the real causes? We're looking at putting much more on women political participation, something clearly where I failed in Lebanon on my last post, but it wasn't for lack of trying, clearly have to adjust course. We're looking at women in the economy, investing in female leadership, but also in female entrepreneurs, and not just small to medium enterprises. It's growing women in all areas of life and society. We will dedicate programs. Last but not least, the long arm of trade. We have significant financial investment exposure and portfolio as the Netherlands, where again I look to bring gender as one of the big decision tickets. You don't pass the gender mark, doesn't get supported. It's as simple as that. It's the only way. For once in my life, I now have not only words, I have a little bit of a toolkit. It's been nice to see if I can deliver what I set out to do in the policy with my colleagues in the ministry, the embassies, all staff and all other ministries. It's my responsibility, and I'll try to hold myself accountable.
No, this would, I think, go a very long way. I think you have a public endorsement on that one. Thank you. I mean, this was, I think, a great ending to the talk, but I want to open it up now to questions from the audience, perhaps. And then Dina. Actually, you know what? I want to start with a woman. Dina. Sorry, my colleague. We'll come back to you. And then Alia.
Hi, my name is Dina. I am a non-resident research assistant at Carnegie. And following up your last comment on your support for women in different aspects in Lebanon, I wanted to just ask if there's anything related to the role of women in the armed forces in Lebanon, if there's any programs, aids. And I'm asking this in specific because I'm working on the civil-military relationship project that, and I'm focusing on Lebanon, so that's the reason behind my question. Thank you.
One of the few females actually working in this sector. Do you want to take a few questions?
Yeah, as you like.
Alia, do you want to? That's right behind you.
Thank you very much. My name is Alia Mubayed. I'm an economist. I have two questions and maybe a few suggestions. First question, as a Lebanese citizen and economist, I had the opportunity, along with Maha, to attend the CEDR conference and speak in the name of the civil society organization. I'm part of an organization called Kulluna Irada. And I would like to ask you, since we know that the Netherlands will be the first country who will host the first follow-up meeting for the CEDR conference once hopefully we'll have a functioning government. And I was wondering whether you can tell us a little bit about what your, I mean, we heard about your expectations here, but I mean, is there a time frame, and where do you see the role of civil society organizations? And if I can take this opportunity to stress upon you that we hope that the Netherlands can follow the steps of France in keeping representation from CSOs, particularly in such a poor governance environment in our country, because this is a way that adds credibility to our policy-making framework and also encourages debate and greater transparency in policy making. dealing. We also encourage you to keep monitoring the monitoring mechanism of CEDR open also to civil society comments and participation. And finally, as a principle, we encourage you really, and maybe this is also a question to you, how can we avoid moral hazard in the donor community dealing with Lebanon? After all, you spoke, you are eager to promote values of climate, respect of climate change, etc. I mean, Lebanon has been polluting the Mediterranean. We have had an agenda that is very controversial vis-à-vis the Syrian refugees, issues that are high on the priority of donors. So how can you avoid moral hazard in, as part of basically funding CEDR and accepting the policies that we are not respecting and that are important on the global agenda? And if I may, I have a question for you as an EU Minister of Trade and Cooperation. I think this is a regional question. I think the EU has been at the forefront of basically cooperation with Southern Mediterranean, from Barcelona to the NEPs, etc. Obviously, the strategic environment for our countries have changed in the South. Yet the framework of the EU in dealing with the countries has not evolved as fast. Do you have particular proposals to revive and make basically the EU partnership with the Southern Mediterranean more attentive to this changing strategic environment, and what would those be? Thank you.
Thank you, Alia. Should we take one more?
She asked a lot of questions. I can be brief. I'm worried I'll forget it, because also I have a broken set of reading glasses, so I can't really read my own handwriting. Okay. No, it's okay. Yeah, I'll go back to the pharmacy. Sorry. Civil-military relations. You know that we've recently contributed in the context of the Rome Conference sort of to the sort of CIMIC effort. In a broader context, in other societies, it's true that when there's a role of female leaders and in the military, when you look at justice or violations of human rights, there's a strong role for women to actually help directly reduce the risk of violations. I am not aware that at the moment we are looking at it in this way. We are designing our new multi-year strategy. So the ambassador is just sitting to your right in front, the gentleman who sticks his hand up, holds his hand up. I would say pursue the conversation with him. Now is the influencing moment. But globally, I see it as very important because we know there's just a measurable shift and change immediately. It's also, of course, about other issues, domestic violence, prevention, serious follow-up on matters that normally get ignored because it's sort of like, well, it's just not important suddenly. So I think there is scope. I can't say if it is for us within our current strategy and set of priorities, that I can't, but I recognize the importance. When it comes to CEDR, I can't speak very much because, to be honest, we have offered, I have to be very straight here, we have offered in Paris, you were there, we have reiterated our offer, but it's really also up to France. It's up to the Lebanese government, when formed, to determine how they want to take the follow-up. It's not just some country like us saying, well, we're happy to offer. We hope that there will be a space for us to deliver on our suggestion, but I wouldn't like to be so presumptuous. However, as a participating country, and because we are donor number 6 to Lebanon at the moment, we will certainly commit to ensuring that the voice, relevance and agenda of civil society, both in issues and monitoring or determining that follow-up really happened by all of us, also us as donors at the end of the day, let's face it, that I think is extremely important. But I can't tell you more about other issues because that would be running ahead of the curve. When it comes to the EU, I think for now, for Jordan and Lebanon in particular, before sort of review what kind of partnership agreements, it's important we address, in fairness, issues of rules of origin and access for companies from Lebanon and Jordan to the European market. I don't think we can, in all fairness, ask you to continue hosting per capita the highest numbers of refugees in the world and then shrink your opportunity to access the market. I have committed this in Jordan and I have reiterated this here. For Lebanon, of course, same as for Jordan, we also therefore need to help you invest in growing the market, building the sort of companies that can actually compete or bridge that access to the European market. So there's a number of steps, but I think that's an important shared responsibility and opportunity. So that's one. The broader issue of the EU partnerships, I think a lot will change. But at the moment, the EU member states are negotiating not only what the budget will be after Brexit, if and when Brexit happens, is one. Secondly, the multi-year financial framework. That is always an internal EU debate. We are also starting negotiations on post-Cotonou. And then separately, of course, the European Partnership Agreements type. So there are many, many, many branches of the same tree. When it comes to the trade agenda, I sit in 2 committees of the European Council. One is development cooperation and one is trade. And then there are some cross-referentials such as the migration task force, which we also finance. I will certainly bear in mind the need for us, at least, to be coherent with our own policy. And that's very important, because often what you find the same as in any country or situation, and I don't think we're better as EU member states. We say one thing here, but then we do something else there. I mean, I used to sort of bemoan that when I was a UN official, and I see we're all making the same mistakes all the time, together. That's human beings for you. But I will commit effort.
Thank you very much.
Not outcome yet.
Amit Timsah, Elin Hon first, and then Basil.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ahmed Timsah. I'm a retired Army General. Well, I'm going to address you about this because I worked before with the Prime Minister Saim Al-Hos, who tasked me with the refugees. As Madame Yahya said, we notice now that most of the Lebanese parties are championing for returning back the Syrian refugees. It started with our Minister of Foreign Affairs, and now it is with Hezbollah. Everybody is bounding their chest that they will help to send the refugees back to Syria. This is going to be a domestic agenda for each part of them. Can you put something, well, I'll put it in other words. Could you advise them that in this issue, this will be an international issue? First, you can stop them there when there is more aggressive way to push these people. I'm not defending anybody. So you will be there to care about those people when they return back home. My second question is you are paying 200 million euros grant.
Million, not billion.
Million, no, million. Oh my God.
Has to be.
200 million, it will be under your close supervision and monitoring, or it will be put under the responsibility of our politicians? That's only a very, very innocent question.
No, the last one is fairly straightforward. I'll answer that one straight away. All our programs are tightly monitored and audited in any country in the world where we work. Secondly, so far we financed UN organizations and NGOs. We have long abandoned the practice of direct budget support to government partners anywhere in the world.
Good afternoon. My name is Basil Kagadou. I'm from the United Nations ESCWA National Agenda for the Future of Syria. My question is to the first part of your intervention, when you said that we are witnessing a sort of a failure of the multilateral system in dealing with crisis throughout the world. And I believe Syria is one reflection of this failure. My question is, what countries like Holland, smaller countries by size, let's say, could have a driver to introduce these reforms and this reflection, and have a leverage on the world order? And the second part of the question is, would the South have a role in introducing and in pushing to these reforms?
I didn't quite hear the last part of your second question.
Would the South, as our countries, be part or should play a part in introducing these reforms?
Well, that's a big question. I'm not sure if I talked about failure. I said lacking in credibility because of non-follow-up or non-compliance. When it comes to the Security Council, we support from many different angles a Europeanization when it comes to the European presence in the Council. Do small member states such as the Netherlands or let's say a Denmark or a Norway or Sweden, do they play a role? I think so. But we can only, I think in general, we try to come up with ideas or proposals. But as you know, it needs a coalition of many. The good thing about today's world is that it's no longer north versus south, east versus west. You have a very different set of alliances around themes or issues. So I think that's where the change potential lies. The world is no longer blocked in the same way. If you look at the Paris agenda, for instance, there's a very interesting set of alliances, even between big cities. And if you look at the US, the big cities said, we're still in. It's a whole new movement. It's a whole group. So people can espouse and commit. Is the multilateral system slow to adapt? Very often, but it's member states, to my mind, that need to take responsibility. And we as the Netherlands certainly do so. But are we David and Goliath? Probably not, but we will invest, and also in good practice. And sometimes incentivization can be small, it's not money. And it's not always the biggest political clout, but you need to work multilaterally with many others to persuade. That's the hard part. There was another question, sorry. Oh.
Yes. Samar Adi from the Arab Weekly newspaper. Mrs. Kaag, you spoke about prevention as a way to prevent conflicts. I mean, prevention, it's a very broad word, and it entails many things. For the EU, how do you see the prevention should be implemented, or how do you see how you will work on preventing conflict in this region? Because you have political issues, economic issues, human rights issues. I mean, it's very broad, you know. And when you spoke about reforming the whole UN, I mean, even the Secretary General was talking about introducing reforms in many bodies and organizations of the United Nations. And we have seen from history, I mean, the League of Nations was reformed after the first, it was established actually after the First World and the UN was, I mean, it was transformed from the League of Nations to the UN after the Second World War. I mean, as I've seen, if you will read history, any changes have been succeeding, they come after, you know, big military events. I mean, how do you see the reform would happen for the current United Nations? And one more question. Do you think that Lebanon's fears are justified with regard to the Syrian refugees? I mean, looking back at the experience with the Palestinian refugee presence in Lebanon. Thank you.
Well, you've asked two very broad historical and geopolitical questions. I will drill them down in two ways, and I'll keep it simple, to be honest, because this needs an entire different discourse. First of all, I'm not the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands. I'm Minister for Development and Trade. Secondly, I'm not the EU representative. We are Netherlands and EU, but I don't want to speak as to what the EU position is on prevention. We have just launched a policy, but on behalf of our cabinet, and for me, this is a prevention agenda, but I've tackled the areas where we can collectively have the greatest influence and change, which is through the pursuit and implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals through a human rights lens, because that is part of an effort to invest in prevention of future risks, future conflicts, deal with the impact of climate change, deal with the consequences of poverty, which also induce, amongst others, irregular migration, people smuggling, trafficking, you name it. That's for us prevention. Is it prevention of all conflicts? No. Is it mediation, conflict mediation? No. It is the strategic approach to the SDGs. So you also lift them out of a time where actually it was said, oh, that's development. So development is here and politics is there and the economy is there. No. The SDGs are precisely constructed in a way that you bring all strands together. And SDG 16, the one on peace and security and transitional justice, is a critical one. It also shows that you won't have justice without development, but you won't have development without justice. You know, it's an obvious story, but that's why we call it a prevention agenda, and that's the first part. The second part, UN reform, I studied international relations, I did a lot of history. I won't go back to that. I think many papers written on it. I think the Secretary General Guterres, I'm saying this now as a member state, and I suppose I have a particular affinity or maybe still some inside knowledge from insider trading knowledge from 9 months ago. I think there's a distinct effort on the 3 pillars of reform that the Secretary General has set out, and that is also our view as the Netherlands. Peace and security pillar, progress is being made. Is it often not yet visible to the eye, except when you're in New York or follow the negotiations? Yes. But in implementation, we need to see the results. It's both effectiveness, efficiency, and clarity. Even renewal of mandates, I mean, an updating and making relevant of mandates. So nothing is stuck in time. As you know that in the past, if a mandate was adopted, you know, the country may have changed, 3 wars may have happened, but the mandate keeps being renewed diligently every 6 months or a year. So it is as an alignment with reality that's important. When it comes to the development system pillars, there's tremendous efforts to make sure there is one voice, one presence, leadership and implementation. So in Lebanon, you are blessed to have so many UN agencies. Does the average Lebanese citizen know who's working for what and mandates? Do you care? No, you shouldn't. You should only see a result of a UN or EU or other presence. You are owed, if those invest, you're owed clarity on what's being achieved, what's being changed. So a lot of it, I think, is also in the political management of the system. Is that possible? Yes. Will member state negotiate? Yes. Will everybody often see a different part of the same reform they want to see? Most likely. But we, I think we have some credibility as a contributor and a loyal contributor to this system. We actually push for the greatest result, which we think aligns with the world we need to live in, like to live in, and I would personally like to see everybody live in. Am I naive? I hope not. I don't think so. I'm a realist, but I think you need to have ideals and you need to pursue the ideals. Otherwise, we live in a very bleak world. Your last question, Syrian refugee presence. I think a lot of it still relates to perception. I'm not denying the socio-economic realities. Lebanese poverty, 25%. Syrian poverty, percentage of Syrian refugees living on the poverty line, 75%. This has increased and continues to increase. This is very concerning from a level of human dignity, protection, and our collective ability to meet the needs. From a UNHCR, I've only read this, so I'm quoting what I've read. You can contradict me. 85% still express the wish to go home. But international community, in support of UNHCR, everywhere in the world, we say when conditions are safe, secure, and there is clarity around the voluntary nature of the return. And that's where the difficulty of reconstruction, of course, comes in. Who goes home when there's nowhere to go to? You like to go home, where to? And a lot of that is political, but of course also depends on political process and the ability for reconstruction to happen. That comes back to my earlier points.
I think actually we just completed a study on the triggers for return, and it confirms exactly that, which is that the majority of Syrian refugees do want to go home, but for them the issue of who will govern is fundamental. Will they be allowed to return home? And what is clear is that the changing legal framework within Syria is actually playing a very big role in preventing people from returning, whether it's law number 10, whether it's vetting, whether it's the conscription, mandatory conscription. Yeah. So there are many other things happening within Syria that play a fundamental role in prohibiting return for refugees that want to go back. Plus a need for some form of accountability, I would say, at that level. I think there's one last question in the back. What was it? There we are.
Hi, my name is Anna. I'm a student from the Netherlands, actually, so it's very nice to meet you here today, Sigrid. I'm currently writing my master thesis on Syrian refugee women here in Lebanon, and I'm also involved in an internship with March Lebanon. In the Netherlands, in our cabinet, people speak about opvang in de regio, or keeping people in the region as much as possible, which is obviously very complicated. So my question is, do you believe that there exists a possibility or even a responsibility for the Netherlands or for the EU to stimulate or even pressure other countries in the Middle East region to take over some of the responsibility for the refugees, or even maybe relieve some of this pressure on Lebanon?
Well, it's two questions. On the one hand, you know, in response to the mostly flow of irregular migrants coming to a number of countries, the whole discussion, the internal migration discussion on management of migration by the European Union leaders is ongoing, and that relates to the so what they call disembarkation points, and then the discussion where who is entitled to asylum versus who needs to be assisted as an irregular migrant to be returned home safely and securely. Not dissimilar from the situation for irregular migrants who are being assisted from Libya to go home via Niger and other places. That's one part. I think the second part indeed is an important one, but that's also where UNHCR is in the lead, to continue to approach, supported by many countries, many other countries also in the region, to say, can you do more? Because if you're a signatory to the convention, there is a responsibility, and it's a shared one. Here UNHCR is in the lead. So far, I know from past experience that none of us have been very helpful. Different countries will give different responses. They will say, oh, actually, you don't know. We're hosting people, X million, where they're not refugees. Therefore, we're already doing our part. It's a continuous debate, particularly with some countries. Also, when you look at donorship and financial contributions. I'm not sure. I think the Global Compact on Refugees, which is being negotiated right now, is a very important formula where we need to reassess what global burden sharing really is and what best approaches are. So I don't want to anticipate that one. I think the negotiations are going very well. But UNHCR is in a good lead, and they are the mandated organization, and we should support all their efforts.
Sigrid, I can't thank you enough for a wonderful conversation,
No, thank you.
but also I think most importantly for your continued advocacy, not only for women, but for fundamental human rights, and for maintaining principles at the heart of politics. And I think this is a very rare trait amongst many politicians, so thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.